Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome to the One Stop Co-op Shop podcast. I am your host, Jason. Thank you so much for stopping by for another one of my discussions. I love entering into these kind of bigger picture topics in gaming. I'm hopeful that this one will be interesting to the audience as well as to aspiring designers out there, because we are going to brush up against a very hot topic. Does this stir up some feelings in the peoples. We're talking about generative AI, especially on the art side of things in board gaming. So I'll get into the whole story of why we're talking about that in a little bit. But before we do that, I want to introduce my esteemed panel. I have two gentlemen who answered the call. I'm so thankful for that. So first, I'm going to introduce a man who is on the art side of things. Currently, they work for WizKids, but they have a whole bunch of credits to themselves, and I'm going to let them introduce. Daniel Solis, tell us all the things that you've done in board gaming, or at least the highlights. Because it's not all, because there's a lot. Highlights.
I'll keep it to current events. My name is Daniel Solis. I am currently the art director at WizKids Games, and I've been a graphic design freelancer for about going on 20 years now in various capacities for different companies in the board game industry.
So also a designer, designed Kodama?
Oh, Kodama, yes.
Kodama. Okay, there you go. Not one that I played, but I said, wow, that design credit as well. I got your reference from Jeff Engelstein. He was the first person he reached out to because he does all the game tech stuff. And for various reasons, he didn't feel comfortable joining us, but he gave me the reference to you, and I'm very glad. I was looking up your bio and everything. Perfect. So thank you so much for joining.
Sure thing.
And we have Chris Cieslik from Asmadi Games. So I have someone from the art side of things and also from the computer side of things. So that will be Chris's role. So please, Chris, the founder of Asmadi Games, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you bring to the table.
Yeah, I bring all the games to the table.
Oh, yeah.
So I run Asmadi Games, and I both develop and design things. The things that folks are probably most familiar with are the Innovation series, which I developed with Carl Chuddick, and more recently the One Deck Dungeon, One Deck Galaxy series, which I've made myself. Back before it was time to make board games, my degree was in computer science, and I actually did research into machine learning circa 2003, back before all of this was super fancy, but some of the earlier stuff.
They were fancy.
Well, I mean,
they were beating the Go masters and chess masters for about a decade now, right?
Yeah. True.
So, and this want to be part of the discussion, right? I mean, so this conversation has burst on the scene, but, if we're talking about this thing called AI, which we will get into what exactly that is, we're not talking about a brand new thing. We're talking about something that's kind of been bubbling up and it's been worked on. And now it entered this new phase, and we'll explain all that. But before we get into that, some disclosures are necessary. Everyone's a friend to everyone in board gaming. So I mentioned about Jeff Engelstein could not join the podcast. The occasion for this show was Indie Boards and Cards released the newest Kickstarter for Terraforming Mars. Very, very popular property. And they announced on the Kickstarter page pretty clearly that they were going to use generative AI for their art, or at least their art department was going to use a platform called, I think it was Midjourney, for their art. So Jeff Engelstein's daughter, Sydney, works for Indie Boards and Cards, so he did not feel comfortable sharing. But I did get a chance to have an extended discussion with him, and so kind of learning, about this stuff, because I'm very, very interested. Daniel, you also have some things you wanted to share with the audience before we started?
Yeah, just a full disclosure. I have a couple of game titles that have been published by Indie Boards and Cards in the past, so that relationship should be disclosed. I don't speak for, I can't speak for them, and I also do not speak for my employer currently. So anything I say here is entirely my own 2 cents for whatever it's worth.
All right, basically a verbal Twitter.
I have to make a small disclosure as well, which I just remembered. A very long time ago, Travis licensed a Resistance themed version of Win, Lose, or Banana. So technically, I have a business relationship with IB&C. And I've known them for ages, and they're mostly good people.
Yeah, this is about having a conversation. This isn't about like a hit piece or anything. I think people get it at this point. Have done how many episodes of discussions, and I just want to give the people as much information as possible. And this will not be the only conversation. I'm very well aware that people feel certain ways, they have certain perspectives, and a certain perspective may emerge from this very conversation. It's not like the end all and be all. So I'm perfectly willing to share, talk with anybody who has feelings in one or the other. Okay, so let us just go back to the very beginning. Chris had mentioned that working in this thing called AI for a long time now. So let's lay some groundwork in layman's terms. Hopefully, Chris could help us out there. So this thing called AI, and leading into this thing called generative AI. Is it possible to come up with kind of a short, pithy way of bringing the peoples into that basic conceptual framework?
So yes and no. One of the biggest problems we're facing right now with the entire discussion ecosystem around AI is that AI is a very short word and is being used as an umbrella term for a ton of different things, some of which are as simple as a Xerox machine, some of which involve neural networks and thinking and, lots of deduction. And this is muddied by the fact that since many of these AI platforms are closed source, we don't actually know what's going on under the hood. AI is, people think Terminator, people think Matrix, people think all this sci-fi stuff where it's like, the computer's devising a calculated plan to do a thing. And in a lot of cases, it's really like, it averaged out, 20 photos to make a different photo. Is that AI? I don't know. People want to say it is, but to me, true AI is something that learns and thinks and adapts to feedback. And I don't know that all of these technologies are there yet. They're at varying levels of approaching that. And that's been evolving since, I was doing research back in college. Back when I was in college, the research I did was training a computer to figure out whether a picture was a bar graph or a line graph. And 20 years ago, that was a really hard problem. And now, we've got computers who are making realistic photos, and you say, draw me a dragon, and it puts something out that looks kind of like it could be in a D&D handbook. But I think one of the things that folks who are reading up on it need to do is realize that the term AI is overloaded right now, especially because businesses are capitalizing on, hey, AI is going to fix all your problems as an advertising point. Right now, like every NFL game, there's IBM ads being like, AI is going to drive your car. It's going to do your laundry. I'm like, okay,
Right.
Go do that.
Okay. So is there a meaningful distinction between like the AI that you're talking about, the bar graph and the line graph thing, and this current generative AI thing? So I'm thinking, this is, maybe even less than a year ago, ChatGPT was the text-based program that quote unquote changed the game and was able to spit out things that sounded plausibly like a human could have wrote them. So and then, we get the art version and the music version, all that kind of thing. So is there did something meaningful really happen? And does it require us to kind of think differently about, all that?
At the same time, computation got a lot faster. And these technologies got developed out more. So that, like the language that ChatGPT puts out right now is pretty amazing. It's believable on the surface until you look at it closely and you're like, wait a second, this is just regurgitating sections of Wikipedia articles or parts of books and things.
Or making stuff up.
Making stuff up whole cloth. So it's hard. Like the place that it's at right now is on the cusp of becoming real intelligence, but I think it's still got some distance to go. The other thing is, people are talking about Adobe's like content aware fill in Photoshop, which until like a year ago you would have just called a plugin. It's it's like, it knows how to guess what's going to be around it based on pattern matching. It's not doing any intelligent thought on it. It's pretty simple pattern matching stuff with a huge library.
So that gets us right to Daniel's part. I mean, this whole AI thing, right? I mean, you're not, I mean, you work in the industry, like you're a graphic designer. You've been, this is your thing. So this thing called AI, how long have you been dealing with that in your career?
Well, about 2 years ago, I had a lot of time on my hands, like a lot of people did. And I saw some folks releasing these what are called like a Google collaboratory environments, where you could if I barely understood it, so I'm speaking very broadly here. But I just looked up as many tutorials as I could, and I saw like, okay, if you replace this section of code with this such and such thing, and you have a library of artwork that you have on your Google Drive, then this model will be trained on that folder, and then it can generate new images. So I was playing around with that, and I knew right away that it was going to be an issue, that like I have to make sure anything I train this model on has to be at least assured to me that is public domain or Creative Commons released. So I restricted all of the library that I had trained this model on public domain illustrations of birds from ornithology books from like before 1950. So these are all like natural history books, and these are all scanned and released on various museums, like Flickr accounts and stuff. So I had this thing, and it was fun. I made these like fun, weird, just horrible looking birds, and gave them funny names, and I made a couple little jigsaw puzzles out of them. And it was a toy at the time, and it was amazing how quickly thereafter, maybe within a couple of months, DALL-E and Midjourney and all these other things came out and like completely surpassed anything I was like messing around with. But the discussion that came out of those generators, for lack of a better term, was something I was spotted early on when I was playing around with my little things. Every time I made a little bird, there would be at least half of the outputs would have these weird phantoms of people or portraits or spaces that I definitely didn't have in my library. So clearly there was some behind the scenes training that the model came with before it was trained on my library, and I could, if, as best as I understood it, adjust some knobs and decide learn more from my library than from whatever you were coming with, and so forth. Like I said, I was a rank amateur. I was fiddling with buttons, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I got it just good enough that I could make some funny looking weird birds. But after I saw the reaction to all of those generators and stuff, I took a step back and tried to assess my own position on the role of a generator in art. And I just couldn't come away with any assurances that anything that's currently on the market was legal enough to even approach, regardless of its quality or how amazing it might be on an individual basis with whatever individual images. If I can't be confident a human artist wasn't copying somebody else, copying somebody's copyrighted work, then I certainly can't be confident enough that an AI isn't doing the same thing. And I'm approaching it from that perspective, that if an artist came to me and they had like a dodgy reputation about copying somebody else's artwork, I would approach them with the same skepticism as I do any generator that I hear about.
So that gets us into the ethical dimension, and we're definitely going to dive into that, in a little bit. I want to take a half step back and kind of make sure we get, take the steps here. Learning, training. That's the thing that you talked about, Chris, in terms of learning and training.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be a lot more understanding, way more than our podcast can provide. We'll do the best that we can in terms of the essence of an AI is like, it is learning, it is training, and then off of that learning and training, it is outputting. So just, do you have any general, like kind of deeper thoughts about how AI does that? Like you mentioned, like a neural network and all that kind of stuff.
So, at the core, you're feeding it a bunch of information. Back when I started, we gave it like 30 images because in 2003, that's what you could do. And if you're talking about like the chess computation stuff from the 90s and the early 2000s, when chess computers took over, they were getting fed hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of chess positions, and not cheating, but being able to outclass a human player because they had a ton of information. And at the core, that's still what trains an AI now in terms of being able to generate art. You give it hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe hundreds of millions of images. I honestly don't know the scale that some of these things use. And it's like, okay, I've seen a bunch of things. I don't actually know anything about them except for maybe some metadata, like, oh, this one's tagged that it's a bird. This one tagged that it's, a meadow. Because the AI isn't actually intelligent. It doesn't have any capacity to reason beyond the pure data you give it. That level of reasoning and learning is something that is still a bit of a ways off. So yeah, the training being purely the data sets you give it is kind of the crux of the morality argument right now, because everyone's like, oh, well, you're just feeding it this database of existing things by artists who didn't get permission. And we'll get to that in a bit, but
right.
It's
And
complicated.
I want to really hammer that down, because I've heard a line of argument, because speaking to the whole like cryptocurrency stuff, that like it is possible to have an AI that is totally fed on, like you said before, Daniel, public domain and Creative Commons, and we can do that, right? And I think what we're trying to say just at this outset is that just by where they are, like we're talking about either ChatGPT or whatever else in the text then, or Stable Diffusion and DALL-E, like they've already been fed tons and tons of copyrighted data. And so it's like, if I sit there and I feed it my own stuff, then that's fine. But like you say before, in the background, in terms of its general knowledge, it's probably been fed some copyrighted stuff or some non-permission stuff. I think they estimated something like, between 14 and 20%. Don't quote me on that, but like some significant part of ChatGPT was trained on people's copyrighted stuff.
When I was making those little birds, the big red flag to me was that I would see Getty Images watermarks pop up on my bird images. I definitely didn't have those in my library.
So like, you mentioned before, Adobe has an AI kind of in there, and I think Adobe tries to kind of like, okay, this is your thing and you feed it your stuff, but in order to be able to do what it does in the first place, it needed to have trained something, and we don't have any assurances right now. In fact, we have assurances the opposite way, that this stuff was trained on quote unquote copyright stuff. I just wanted to kind of set that scene. Is there anything else you want to say about in terms of the learning process before we get into the more ethical dimensions, Chris?
Yeah, what I would say, and Adobe, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, whoever, if you believe what they are saying about literally anything, you're being sold a bridge. I'm sure they're all going to be like, yeah, we're training this on completely public domain data and stuff, and they've all been sued 1 billion times by every government on the world for lying about stuff very much like this data collection for personal data in Europe or whatever. I don't really trust them. I mean, I don't blame the engineers in these companies. They're just doing what they're told to do, but I don't buy it. I'm sorry.
All right, so I think that's a pretty good pivot point in terms of shifting the discussion from the understanding what's going on to now some of the ethical stuff. So I want to ask this bridge question. I want to get both of your perspectives. Okay, so we're talking about learning. We're talking about kind of AI ingesting data and then using that data to, X, Y, Z, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, and then it produces stuff. So another kind of argument that I've heard is that that's what humans do too. Humans don't produce stuff just sui generis out of nowhere. We're always taking in stuff from our environment, and then we do a bunch of mishigash in our brains, and then we produce something. So, and I'll ask Chris first, and I'll go to Daniel. Is there a meaningful difference, say, if I were to read some bunch of comic books, and then I would have produced my own comic that was quote unquote inspired by having been fed this quote unquote data about, all this comic book stuff. It's going to come out a lot like all the comic books that I read. Is there a meaningful difference between me doing that and a Stable Diffusion or a DALL-E or one of these AI programs?
My quick answer to this is that the meaningful difference is that you are not a computer. And I know that sounds like sort of a cop-out answer, but it really is the crux of the answer. You're a human being, and you are having other thoughts in the background while you're, being heavily inspired. And let me say, obviously all of us who grew up as artists or creators of any type, the first thing we did was copy something. You know, whether it's making a board game in 4th grade that looked a whole lot like Monopoly or some other roll and move, or, you know, artists who traced comic books that they grew up watching. The big difference, though, is that the computer isn't continuing to think as it copies. It just copies and copies and copies. And if I take a download of Stable Diffusion and run the same seed number and ask it to generate the same thing, it's going to give me the exact same image every time. It's never going to learn. I'm going to tell it, hey, that's got 6 fingers. And it's going to be like, okay, I'll try again. And it's going to draw the exact same image again.
Interesting. Okay.
That learning is happening on their servers eventually when they release a new version. And it's not quite the same. Obviously, these are all big simplifications of what's going on.
Sure.
But that's the crux of what I think the difference is.
It's a huge difference. And I think it's kind of the $64,000 question because, well, you know, we're going to talk about the quote unquote stealing aspect, you know, like AI is scraping and stealing and all that kind of thing. And the idea is like, okay, if what makes a human being inspired different than a computer scraping? And I think we're all kind of fumbling around like so many of us have the instinct that it's different. So I'm glad you said you put the question the way you did. Like it is different when a human does it and a computer does it. But I don't know if we all have the answers as to what the difference is quite yet. But at least that's where, in terms of framing a discussion, I think that's where we want to be. So Daniel, what do you think about that answer? What is the difference between a human copying, being inspired by, versus an AI doing the same thing?
I mean, from my experience playing around with these tools, admittedly, at a very surface level, versus my history of actually working in art direction, the main difference to me is just I can rely on a human to understand my direction better. I can pinpoint certain areas and say, revise this based on a client or the licensor saying that they need this to be case in point, for example, we have say I have a game that's a licensed property. We send the art to approval to licensing. The holder of the IP then contacts, if this is a live action property, the representation for the actor, who in their contract has a clause that say they have to approve any of their likenesses that appear in any printed media, whether it's a board game, comic book, or whatever. And that art and that actor says, I look a little too grumpy there, for example. Can I look a little bit happier? And so goes back through the filter and back to me after all those like links in the chain. And then I have to go to the artist and say, so we have some feedback, yada yada yada. With my experience, I can tell the artist more specifics, like, okay, the client has identified that this face looks a little bit too grumpy. Raise the eyes, open the eyes, raise the eyebrows, lower the contrast so you see fewer wrinkles, adjust the lighting. I can get very specific, and the artist understands 100% exactly what I'm saying. Especially, I can find other images. I can find studio shots of the actor, for example, where they have a different angle or whatever, and use that as reference. But all of that is so much easier to do than spending hours and hours and hours waiting for a model to learn something, and I don't know what they're learning, and all of that, and I may not even get something as good as the first image that I started with. It may be worse than the first image, and so I have to. What do I do then?
So if, just to be clear, if I'm using a Dolly or Stable Diffusion, I can't just type in, like, it produces something. So I cannot just type in, make it look younger, and then it produces something that's younger. Like I can't trust it to do that.
You can reseed it with the image and give it more direction, but
yeah, it's not consistent. Like it's you're kind of talking to a machine, and the machine just doesn't really quite understand the nuances. Like I work with international artists a lot in international studios. And so sometimes you have to worry about a language barrier. And so you have to tailor your art direction and be careful about how you word things to make sure that they'll translate correctly. So you avoid overuse of metaphors or vague language. You have to be very precise. And even with that, sometimes there's some misinterpretation, but that's recoverable. That can be fixed with just another email or just a small correction. But that language barrier never goes away in my experience with an AI. It's just they're gonna go ahead and do whatever it thinks it's right, and it doesn't respond to my feedback. So yeah, that's the primary difference. It's like it's like a very talented toddler. Like it may make one good image, but it just doesn't understand what it is that I actually want.
Well, can I push you a little bit here? Because I'm so glad you used the metaphor of language. Can I say that, okay, AI speaks in a different language, and if you, Daniel Solis, are resistant to learning that language, well, then is that a problem with the AI or is that a problem with Daniel Solis? So it's like, I mean, and so there's a lot of some artists are going to be like, okay, oh, like it's almost like their home language is AI, and they're able to kind of like play in it and produce what they want with it and everything. So what's the difference between that and working with an international artist, as an example?
Well, in that case, so that kind of gets into the realm of prompt engineering, which is like a sort of like a cabin hobby within a cabin hobby of AI development, where people are getting more and more specialized in what are the magic words that are required to get an image to look a certain way. So they'll identify certain types of camera settings that you can put into a prompt so that the lighting and the colors will be a certain way. It used to be that you could just drop in the name of a director or a photographer or an artist and get stuff in their style. Thankfully, that's being filtered out now by some of the more prominent generators. But regardless of whatever the prompt may be, or how it may be worded, I'm not being paid to do that. I'm being paid to get the art as quickly as possible on a budget, and you would think that a machine that automatically magically makes tons of artwork would be a fantastic product for me to look at and be tempted by. But nothing I've seen so far has been at all interesting to me, mainly for the consistency issue, if not only for the legality and the language barrier of it all. It's just there are too many obstacles in the way for me to even approach it as a plausibility over just hiring a human and getting it done faster.
From your perspective as running a game company, Chris, is that your experience with some of this stuff?
I mean, we haven't, for obvious reasons, based on how I'm talking about, we haven't actually tried any of this for real professional stuff at all.
I'm sure you're looking at it. I mean, every company has to look at it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I have played around with it personally. Some of the engines a little bit just because it's interesting as a computer science thing. But in terms of this is just a myriad of legal reasons I don't want to do it, in addition to the moral reasons I don't want to do it. The fact that your work might just be copyright invalid entirely is kind of scary.
That's a non-starter.
This. Yeah. I don't want to deal with that problem.
No, I say that again, that copyright invalid, like, the AI produces something and it's like too close to something that is copyrighted.
No. If something is AI generated, it might just not be copyrightable, period. Okay. This is a question that the courts are going to incompetently decide at some point in the near future. They have no effing clue what they're doing because it's the courts and it's technology.
Right.
But there will be some landmark ruling which will, happen. And the precedent people set, there was a case a while back where a photographer put his camera down, and a monkey picked it up and took some pictures. And the courts ruled that you couldn't copyright those photos because they were taken by a monkey who doesn't have any, legal claim to them. So they were instantly public domain. And does that extend to a computer? Is a computer a monkey? Or is it a tool being used by a human being to create art? And you add in all the questions about sourcing, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I guarantee they're going to make the wrong choice. I don't know what that choice is going to be, but that's what the courts do. It's an American tradition.
Okay, so we are getting into, now we can kind of dive in a little deeper into the ethical stuff. And I think that there are a couple of different angles on this, and I'm going to ask I guess, Daniel's help in particular, unpack it, because this is either your career at this point. This is they're looking at this. So say a little bit more about the idea of, they're stealing my art, right? Like, I mean,
Mm.
What is the tangible harm? So, I mean, if I produce something and someone imitates it, then okay, or whatever. Someone steals my catchphrase or steals whatever. And I guess some people are out there having trouble discerning. Okay, well, it did that, but what's the harm? So maybe you can articulate, why that seems to, besides just like the conceptual, that quote unquote stealing stuff. What is the concrete harm that an artist faced when faced with some of the AI stuff?
In the case of, say, for example, if you're an artist and you have a distinctive style, and you have some generator that's been trained without your knowledge on your portfolio, and you have some unethical end users that just generate a bunch of images that have somehow been trained or prompted by your style, that's money out of your pocket, theoretically. This is under the assumption that those unethical end users would have paid that artist to begin with, which is an assumption. Whether it's a correct or incorrect assumption is another matter. But the theory is that that yes, that is money outside. I'm taken out of the artist's pocket because that is a job they didn't get. And in my case, if I'm hiring for art, the budget option that we have at our disposal now is stock images. So those the legalities have been secured by a third party, the stock image provider, say for example Getty or Shutterstock, and the users and content creators of those platforms have come to agreements with that third party to host their images. And then we can legally license those images for whatever purposes that have been outlined in the contract, and we can even manipulate those depending on circumstances. So in that case, there are legal channels by which we can get access to very, very good imagery on a cheap budget that don't require stepping into this gray market weird area that has not yet been fully outlined yet. So I kind of rambled there for a minute, but essentially, yeah, I'm just like I feel no great compulsion to pursue generators of any quality for an actual commercial product.
Yeah, I think in terms, so getting, I don't want to go too far to the Terraform Mars example, but it's like, it's right in the face, right? And not only did we have just the disclosure, there was an excellent article by Charlie Hall who interviewed Travis, and Travis, the person who's running Indie Boards and Cards, and he gave some like real thorough representation of his rationale of like why AI. Really, so much of it came down to money. It is cheaper to have a person or a in-house entity. In this particular case, it was in the Fricks brothers' house, who's the designers of the game, and they use this, they use the Midjourney thing to just put a bunch of prompts in there, feed it a bunch of images, it put out stuff. And that process, I think in the article he mentioned about speed, it's much faster. That whole process, like you describe, like, okay, go to the artist, give me this, give me this, give me this. Like, if in a case Terraforming Mars, it's a space game, you're not there for the art really. So it's like, okay, give me some space, give me some, rovers, give me this, give me that, and they're happy with that, and that's just like really fast, and time is money. So I think there is a fear that because of that kind of scenario where that a company does stand to save a lot of time and money that using AI, that there's gonna there's gonna be the future, and therefore what you were saying before, like money out of an individual artist's pocket. So how realistic is that fear?
Oh, it's completely realistic.
Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
If I look at it from the cold hard number calculus, for example, the way I would look at it, it's going to cost a fraction, if I don't care where my art comes from, of what the costs are now to hire an artist to spend time actually drawing things. And I think for sure you're going to see companies do this. Marvel just put out an AI-driven opening sequence for what was it, Secret, the show I can't even remember the name of because it was so bland. And somebody else did something similar. There was a Fallout poster for a game that was really bad AI. The Essen posters were embarrassingly bad AI. And those, not a single one of those decisions was an art director being like, you know what we should do? Let's make some crappy art for more money. No, they wanted to save buck because some middle manager said, your budget is $8 for this. And that's what you're stuck with. And we're going to see this calculus made all across the tech industry, the movie industry. Thankfully, we just won the strike over there and a little bit of pushback happened, but it's still coming. They can finally automate away creativity. And that is the one thing that that the business owners have never been able to do for centuries. And now they've got it at their disposal, and they're salivating at the savings that they can pocket.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Just to finish that thought, I'm so glad that you mentioned in terms of the history of it, in terms of the labor saving. Like I think you're gonna and I'm trying to kind of bring in the voice of kind of the techno optimist, right? And the idea that like, okay, since the Industrial Revolution, maybe even before, technology has proceeded, and there have been freakouts about like, oh, this is going to change, it's going to change, this is going to change. And it turns out that society kept on going. Railroads put a bunch of people out of work, but then it created all these new jobs, right? So it's like, and so the idea being that technology ultimately creates more labor than it takes away, as long as you kind of like let the technology wheels churn, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the things that you are pointing to is that this feels different because normally technology takes away work that is repetitive and dirty and dangerous. So, better robots that do mining, better robots that do, fabrication and all that kind of thing. The sewing machine and all the like machines take away the dreariness of the work. This may be we're on the cusp of like a new era of history where technology replaces the creative stuff, that stuff that we thought that was the province of humans. And now it turns out that, whatever is being produced is being received as this is creative stuff. And it's being pitched as this is creative stuff. So that's, I guess, in terms of explaining some of the freak out, that's also kind of in the mix, along with the ethical things. So I apologize. You had a thought. Dan, I had to build
No. I mean, if we're going to talk about history, we can go into the art history of it all, and and there have been periods during the rise of the Industrial Revolution and during the early 20th century where various art movements like Futurism and Dadaism have reacted to the automation and the rise of the machine. Rise of the machines is a rather dramatic way of phrasing it, but the mechanization of warfare and all those things. The reaction to that from the art world was manifold. But one of the reactions was, well, what if we were to just go into a more automatic state in the creation of our artwork, where it doesn't have to make sense, and so you get the school of surrealism, where they tap into something very subliminal, and they don't really care what interpretation necessarily you're going to come into it with. But I think a better example is abstract expressionism. Jackson Pollock, you may have seen photos of him in a trance-like state where he's just standing over a canvas and he's just splashing artwork or splashing paint everywhere, layering it thick. Retroactively, you can kind of approach that and say, oh, he's using this as a mechanism to channel something more primal. But I'm pretty sure that he would be selling his artwork by the foot. He would just take a big old canvas, chop it up into little pieces, and sell it piece by piece, because he was making a commercial product to some extent. For him, as I understand it, for him, the act of making the art was the artwork itself, and the artifact that remained behind was just a relic thereof. It was the stuff that was left over, and so he would happily sell it, because the visuals of it for him didn't really matter. Sorry, I tend to ramble when it comes to art history stuff, but
you're so excited.
yeah. Sorry.
Well, I mean, you're putting your finger on something. It's like, I mean, I think the idea that art is reduced to the final product And if we kind of go along this line of like, AI art, so to speak, we're already kind of presupposing something that is not necessarily true. That like art is about the final product. And if it's a final product, then let's make it cheap, let's make it blah, blah, blah. And there's a whole world of ways to think about this that may be at risk of being lost if we kind of go too far down that road. I think that's kind of what I'm getting from you saying.
Yeah, I have to really constrain where I can speak with any degree of authority.
Sure.
For me, where I'm coming from is strictly in the realm of commercial images. These are not things that necessarily would go up into a gallery. I aim for high quality images for all of any product that I work on. I work very hard on typography and graphic design, and I work hard to find the right artists and get the right images for the project. But that said, that's a different endeavor than an artist who's making art purely for the joy of it and to express something deep within themselves. There can be overlap between those two efforts, but ultimately there is a client at the end of this that wants to see something that they want to see, and they want to sell it. And so I can only really speak to that end of things. But before I get too far afield, I should clarify that.
Right. And so I guess we can kind of come around the bend and look at the future a little bit. So that is the core of the freak out. There's an ethical freak out about like, copyrighted material and everything. And ultimately, there's a freak out about the artist's ability to sustain themselves. And will we just get will we get more art, but fewer artists, in this paradigm? So that's a kind of open question that we're playing with. And also just, okay, so like just the ability of the artist to sustain themselves. I mean, what do you think, just like off the top of your head, in terms of what you're seeing? Do you foresee kind of a gloom and doom scenario? Like, Chris had just articulated that, like, companies are going to do this. If they can get away with 8-cent art and people won't give them guff, they'll do it. So do you foresee, in terms of, the tools and, a scenario where you're going to have far fewer artists, all of whom are good at AI, who correct the 6th finger, they turn it into the 5, and that's what they do. And then do you foresee that future, or do you think there's some left turns awaiting us? Daniel.
From my end, I think the key is just disclosure. So you may have heard stories of an artist inadvertently submitting work that they did not disclose was partially generated by AI and then cleaned up by their own hand, or that they started with a sketch and then fed it to a model and had that model fill in the details. That's a very gray area in terms of how they made the images. But what's not gray is that they didn't disclose the source of the image or the tools that were used in the process of making that image. And I think if we're going to be continuing to live in a world where we have very advanced image generators, I hesitate to call them AI art or even AI, because as Chris said, these things they may be artificial, but they may not be intelligent. Or at least
I've heard these called like glorified autocomplete.
It's more than that, but it's definitely not intelligence yet.
Right. So these are generated images is like the very plain way of phrasing it, that I hope is without affect. So these generated images may be plentiful, and some of them individually may be very good. But if I was to evaluate a portfolio of an artist, and I'm comparing many different artists' portfolios for a project, I would look at the portfolio, quote unquote, of Midjourney as an artist, for example. Just whoever did the prompts, I'm just going to treat Midjourney as the artist, and I would see an artist that is very adept at making individual things that are extremely tightly rendered, but they lack the consistency to be directable. And this artist, they may be cheap, they may be able to produce so much prolific work that would be fantastic, but if I can't tell them what exactly I want and get that first image done right the first time, they're not going to be as interesting to work with or as profitable. I would rather work with a human that I can talk to and get the right image the first time or the second time, instead of having them just generate a whole bunch of stuff and I have to pick and choose from a whole wall. yeah, that's how I prefer to work. I hope, I'm not sure if I can speak for any other art directors out there, but that's just how I am.
So there's some speed bumps, it's not just like this train to everyone in the unemployment line or whatever the thing is. I mean, there's going to be a lot of
Not for
the
me.
kinks to work out along the way.
I
What
will
about
say,
you? Yeah, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Just on that note, you mentioned a little bit of optimism. I do use some. I guess these are generative tools. I do use things that any kind of upscaling is great.
Right.
If I'm getting an image from a licensor that is like just a little bit under print resolution, and I can upscale that now to something that is print resolution, that's fantastic. And I understand that some of those tools have some relation to the same technology as generative images, and of course filling in details around if I'm given an image that doesn't have enough of a bleed around the edge, and I can actually just go ahead and generate that extra little 3 millimeters around the edge that won't ever actually be seen in the first place. Ideally, then that's great too. And I guess you might call those restorative AI instead of generative AI. I'm not entirely sure.
Extrapolation AI is what I would call them. It's taking something that clearly truly exists already and repairing or extending an existing artistic work.
Yeah. Those I'm like, I have no trouble using. I use them more and more frequently. And if we get more of those tools, I'm great. Like that'll be fine for me. It's this creation whole cloth of new images I have no interest in.
Right.
So we know we can glean this answer from the way you answered the court question, Chris. But your level of optimism, in terms of the AI as a labor issue, it's like, are we going to just get a diminution of artists? Are we on that road? Do you feel like there's a possibility that like new jobs will be created, new ways of creating art, more open, more artists, quote unquote, will have stuff open to them because they can use the tools and etc. Are you optimistic or pessimistic or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, listen. So the difficult thing is that we have talked for almost an hour, and we are about 0.2% through the discussion that could happen of this topic, because it is tremendously complicated. People are not monsters for using AI. They are not doing it with some exceptions, with evil in their hearts, being like, haha, I'm gonna ruin the artist's jobs forever. A lot of folks are doing it because they don't have another option. I've seen several like beginning designers be like, I can't hire an artist, I have no money at all. I'm gonna put this game together because I can make the game design, and I'm just gonna whip up some weird prompt art and put it in there as prototype. I don't love it, but I also understand where they're coming from. I do think, as with any automation throughout the history of labor, it's going to push labor out. It's not quite there yet, but as people get better at it, they surely will. I think that plenty of artists will continue still doing art, but this will take away jobs. This is going to reduce going rates for things, and that's just reality. But I understand why some people want to use this thing, and in the same way that in a perfect world we would produce all of our games in the United States of America, and they would be of great quality, and it's just not realistic. I held that line for a long time. I printed in the US for much longer than most folks did, and I still do some of my printing here, but most of the games have to be made in China or elsewhere in Asia. It's just the reality of being able to pay people. If I don't do that, I can't do my payroll. I won't have enough dollars. And there's a lot of other similar things that you have to make compromises when you're running a business. Sometimes the moral thing doesn't win out. I try and do it as best as I can, and I think most people do too. But yeah, like it is in many ways a freight train. AI art and generative art, whatever you want to call it, isn't going away, and it's going to keep getting better and better. My solution is that we're just going to label our products as made by people, and if people value that, then they can value that as part of our product, in the same way that I put made in USA on some of our games, because people value that as a slight pushback against not so great labor practices over there.
Mhm.
And I think that if we try and fight this fight, if it even is a fight, by saying that company's evil for doing this thing, we're going to lose horribly. That never works. You can go centuries back and look at every single automation battle that has ever been fought in any labor situation. You lose.
Right.
People want their stuff for cheap. And frankly, the average consumer does not give the slightest expletive word about
Terraform Mars made like 3 million.
Yeah, no,
you had a Twitter freak out, but it doesn't matter. Project well done.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. I do think though, and so circling back to kind of the ethical stuff in terms of like, okay, is this thing, chomping, scraping, whatever word you want to use, like people's stuff without permission? That's a real thing, right? Just because it's technology doesn't mean that it could just do anything it wants. And I think I'm a little bit skeptical. That's my own personal bias. When it's like, oh, technology is great and everything, but then it's like, okay, what's it really doing? Oh, right. It's I think an artist friend of mine put it as, imagine something hacked into your email and scraped your private portfolio from your email. And all of a sudden you see it in the wild, and it's not yours, but it says it's yours. How would that be? And it's like, no, that's not something I want. And so I think a lot of artists are just feeling that. So that's almost like a ground level thing, like that. The courts have to handle it. That's immediate. So there's immediate issue, and then there's the larger question of like what to do with this big thing. But I think the immediate issue, we got to work on this. And I think from understanding from your comments, Daniel, you're there. Like you are not going to touch this stuff until they work that out. Is that correct?
Yeah. And even then, I don't want to be the first adopter of it. I don't want to be the one that's a guinea pig of this whole thing. No.
Okay. So we're coming to the end of our time. Is there anything that I missed in terms of a big picture? Yeah, I know. I hear you, Chris. This could last many hours. But I'm a layman. I'm just learning and stuff like that. I'm hopeful that that some broad points were discussed, some conversational frames were set in terms of like how to talk about some of this stuff. Is there anything big that I missed that we should bring up? I'll go to you, Chris, and then go to Daniel.
So what I would say to sum up the entire situation is people should not treat this as simple as an issue as saying NFTs were. NFTs were simple fraud.
Garbage.
This is not that. This is a complex situation that is dealt best with talking to people. The rhetoric on the internet on this topic is so toxic and so useless that it just degenerates into shouting at each other. And this is a thing that lots of conversations need to happen as opposed to typical internet shouty shout.
All right. Anything, any parting words on this one, Dan? Anything we missed, or kind of possible conversation threads for the future?
This is tangential a little bit, but if you are a human artist and you're listening to this, and not a machine, my advice to you, if you're concerned about this, is to email me your portfolio and let me look at it. And if you're looking for work, I can probably point you to, if not me, another publisher who is looking to hire an artist with your style. Chances are, if you're a beginner, you're gonna struggle a little bit, but in time, as you develop your skills and your experience, there is work for you out here still, and certainly from me and many others. So I wouldn't sweat it too much myself, but that's just me.
But that's what we do on the internet. We sweat.
Send me your portfolio.
Okay, so this was a little bit of an optimistic conversation. I think we have two skeptics that we're talking about, three really, including the host. But I think that there's lines for exploring some of this stuff more. I mean, address the ethical questions and let's talk. And I think many of us are in kind of a prove it stage. It's not yes, it's not no. It's like just prove that this can be beneficial and that we can keep humans at the center, and then we can talk. So I think that's a good enough place to land. So Daniel Solis, Chris Cieslik, thank you so much for taking the time here in the One Stop Co-op Shop, for sharing your thoughts. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you can change your mind, you can change the world, people. So until next time, bye everybody.